Hello, and welcome to Sustainability Marketing, Lecture 12, Reframing Sustainability Marketing. This is Episode 2, Towards a Sustainable Society. In Episode 1, we thought again about sustainability marketing and reviewed sustainability marketing and why it was maybe an unconventional approach to marketing. In this episode, we'll look at how we move towards a more sustainable society, a larger and more fundamental challenge than simply trying to change the nature of marketing and the way in which marketing operates within society. In terms of the learning outcomes for this episode, we'll reconsider sustainability marketing by putting it in its broader social and economic context. We'll have a little explore of alternative economic approaches that maybe have the potential to promote more sustainable living and also more sustainable production and consumption systems, as well as more sustainable marketing. And finally, try and appreciate some of the shifts that may have to be undergone in the marketing mindset, really to allow marketers to make substantive progress in the journey towards true sustainability. In terms of the structure of the episode, we'll look at how we make progress towards sustainability marketing. We'll look at some visions of sustainable economies for the future, aspects of what we might call a one planet economy, and finally look at how we might go about changing the marketing mindset. In terms of moving towards a more sustainable society, to a large extent, it's about moving towards a different type of economy. And I mentioned in the last episode the notion of industrial ecology, because ecological systems tend to be very resource efficient. They're based very much on the circulation of resources by living entities. There tends to be very little waste, effectively. And by contrast, industrial systems that we've developed tend to be relatively wasteful, relatively resource intensive. Hawken and Lovins, in their book Natural Capitalism, said that if you look at a typical industrial supply chain, it's made up of, you take material resources from the earth, you make some kind of useful product out of it, customers buy and use it, and it's then thrown away to form some kind of waste. And that's actually a relatively inefficient way of delivering value ultimately through the system. Something like only 6% of the total material consumed in the production process is actually embedded in the ultimate product that reaches consumers. So it's really a very enduring model that we have, this relatively linear type of industrial structure. We can see some improvements. In some markets, we're seeing remanufacturing and sort of reverse logistics efforts bringing value back into the supply chain at the beginning rather than just things being thrown away in waste. We're seeing improvements to the efficiency levels of material and energy within the production system. We're finding ways of helping customers to be more efficient in how they use and dispose of products. And yet the system still has not fundamentally changed. We haven't yet moved to a truly circular economy. And I think it's quite sobering to think about, if we think of the year 2012, the year when the second edition of the book was published and in which these lectures were recorded, 2012 is quite an interesting year in many ways in terms of anniversaries. It's 50 years now since Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, was published. It was the first real global wake-up call to the environmental impacts of particular production systems, in her case focused on the chemical industry, but it was almost the first time that those issues have been taken seriously by many people. It's now 25 years since the Brundtland Report. The Brundtland Report put the idea of sustainable development into the mainstream thought of politicians, of businesses, of society more widely. And it really gave a sense of urgency to the need to change the way in which we live, the way in which we produce and consume, because increasingly it was unsustainable. It's now 20 years since the original Rio Earth Summit, the conference that looked at sustainable development and produced really tremendous degree of media interest, brought together many representatives from governments, from NGOs, from companies, to look at how we could really start to change the nature of society to make it more sustainable. Despite all those anniversaries, if we look on 50, 25, 20 years from each of those events and look at the world around us and think, well, to what extent has it substantively changed? The homes we live in are still pretty much the same as the types of homes we lived in 20, 25, 50 years ago. The average European house, for example, is now something like 22% more energy efficient than it was 20 years ago. Although ironically, it also uses 4% more energy in total. Why? Because our homes have many more energy-using appliances within them. We tend to be doing things like taking more showers within our homes. So we're finding more ways to use energy within our homes, even if our homes are more energy efficient. Our cars are more energy efficient and less polluting than they were 20 years ago, but there are more of them and we're tending to drive them further. So we're not really seeing the substantive changes, the foods in the supermarkets. Yes, there's more organic food than there was 20 or 30 years ago, but there's also more food that would have travelled from countries relatively far away by air freight available on supermarket shelves. So in those key markets that are crucial for sustainability in our lifestyles, I think we haven't yet really seen the transformation of them towards significantly more sustainable systems. So sustainability marketing, I think, is trying to play its part in developing that move towards a more sustainable society and economy by building on notions of relationship marketing and building long-lasting value relationships with consumers, and also bringing in those principles of making marketing more ecologically efficient and better in terms of environmental protection, and also more ethical in terms of addressing social justice and avoiding social problems generated by production and consumption. So sustainability marketing is trying to play its part, but it can't necessarily do it on its own. And to return to the idea of marketing within its world that we looked at back in Lecture 2, yes, the firm is at the centre of the sustainability marketing world, and much of what we've been talking about is about firms changing their behaviours, changing their products and services, developing new solutions for customers, maybe thinking very differently about the way in which the business is run and the way in which the supply chain that backs the business up is managed. And yet really there's a whole range of other things that I think will need to change beyond the actions of individual firms and individual consumers if we're going to move towards a more sustainable society. Governments have a role to play through regulation, for example. Communities can get together and often develop solutions, whether it's community food schemes, community energy schemes, community waste schemes that contribute towards more sustainable lifestyles for the people within those communities. The media has a role to play. It can be very influential in terms of whether people find particular sustainability solutions acceptable or attractive. Investors are important in terms of particularly their expectations and the pressures they will put on companies for a certain return of profit, and how short-term or long-term they're willing companies to have in terms of the time horizon for their strategies to develop profitability. So in terms of who is going to help society to move towards a more sustainable future, the answer I think has to be everyone, effectively, that each of these parties has a part to play. And I've been to many conferences or many events where it sort of degenerates into a debate about, well, whose responsibility is this? Is it about government and regulation, and unless they pass laws to change what companies do or consumers do, we won't get towards sustainability? Other people will say, no, that won't work. You need to make the market work for you. We need to have companies developing solutions for consumers because the consumers want them. We need these market-driven ways forward. That's what will give us the greatest progress towards sustainability. From a personal perspective, I don't think it's a question of a choice. I think the scale of the transformation we're talking about in moving towards a more sustainable society, really in every country around the globe, is such that you need everybody to play their part. All different organisations, institutions, down to individuals need to play a part. So it's very much, I think, something that has to be thought about collectively. And that then extends really to the dominant social paradigm within which we live. Our notions about acceptable freedoms, about the nature of politics and what politicians should deliver for us and pursue. Our culture and what we consider important and attractive and acceptable. All these things may have to change. Our approach to economics and how we value things may have to change. The types of technology we look to embrace and encourage and apply within our societies. Again, just hoping that technologists will be able to come up with solutions to solve environmental problems is looking like an increasingly forlorn hope. So yes, we have to look to technology to help us, but maybe not overly depend upon it. So we're probably looking for a really wide range of shifts in terms of attitudes within society and different elements of that dominant social paradigm, really to create a sustainability-orientated paradigm, a way of thinking about the world, about society, about business, within which decisions and actions to make progress towards sustainability are more acceptable and really make more sense to all the different stakeholders. We can see it as really a process of evolution. That the model here by Brezet and Van Hemel I think is interesting because it's talking about design as an approach to sustainability issues, and the way in which there are maybe different steps in the process over different time horizons with different degrees, you might say, of radicalness. And that really we've been so far mainly in stage 1 and stage 2 of improving products and redesigning products. So if we think about cars, for example, over the last 10, 20 years, we've seen more fuel-efficient cars being developed. We've seen different types of car being developed, for example, like hybrid engines, all of which deliver some improvement. And then we've also sort of seen product redesign in terms of a different type of product and service being offered. So, for example, we might move more towards car sharing schemes, where we're using the same types of vehicles as before, but in a different and more environmentally efficient way. Function innovation, where we start actually using the products differently. So perhaps we only use cars for certain journeys. Maybe we don't go for individual car ownership, that we lease them within communities. And then finally, the notion of system innovation, something much more radical, where maybe we start designing our cities and our towns so that people really don't need private cars, and that maybe you can just have a handful of cars that are available to lease or share through mobility schemes for journeys between places. But within places, there are public transport solutions, there are easy walking or cycling solutions, so that really private ownership of cars within towns, within cities, begins to make far less sense than it does today, and that we maybe have a totally different type of social system within which people are consuming. So these different levels of change that we've been very much looking to consume the same way very often, but by changing the product and changing the way the product works, maybe helping to reduce our environmental and social impacts. For the future stages to move more towards genuine sustainability, we'll probably have to look at much more radical ways of changing the ways in which we consume and ultimately the ways in which we live. There's been a considerable debate in recent years about really the emphasis that society and which governments places in particular on economic growth. That really since 1930, the notion of GDP, gross domestic product, has been the key indicator that governments have used for the success or failure of their policies. All around the world, countries are tending to say, well, we need economic growth, we must pursue economic growth. And yet we know from the sustainability data about environmental systems in particular, that we're already consuming and producing globally at a level that the planet can't support anymore. So for governments, for many, many years, they've always tended to think of growth, economic growth, as the solution. Increasingly, what we're recognizing now is that growth is actually the cause of the problem, and that more growth will not necessarily solve the problems that we have. So alternative ways of thinking about measuring progress in society are being developed. The problem with something like GDP is it's a purely quantitative measure. It just measures how much economic activity goes on in the economy, and particularly in terms of goods and services that are paid for. It doesn't differentiate between the good and the bad. So, every time there's a pollution incident, for example, every time there's some form of accident in which cars are crashed or people are hurt, because that all generates goods and services in terms of repairing the damage, then that all contributes to economic growth. So we perhaps need a system that starts to look at social progress in terms of not how much stuff is done, how much stuff is paid for, but how we can maximize the good and minimize the bad. And we've seen a number of initiatives really trying to think about how we measure progress, how we measure society's prosperity in different ways. One major example was the report led by Joseph Stiglitz, the renowned economist, that was commissioned by President Sarkozy when he was president of France, looking at the feasibility of developing alternative indicators to GDP to measure our social progress. I think the most interesting and comprehensive approach to this comes from Tim Jackson, who wrote the report Prosperity Without Growth. It was commissioned by the UK's Sustainable Development Commission. And Tim Jackson's report was very interesting in that he consulted really everybody around the world who was working on alternative economic models, alternative ways of measuring social and economic progress, to understand, well, is there an alternative to growth as a social, as a target for society? And his conclusions were that simply pursuing growth will ultimately be self-defeating. It is unsustainable. But what we face is a rather split situation across the globe. That in industrial economies of like North America, Western Europe, Japan, and other industrialized countries, growth really would be the problem if we continued it, that it would just lead to unsustainable levels of consumption and production. Yes, there are opportunities to decouple absolute levels of economic growth to environmental damage. You can do things more efficiently, but ultimately more growth is going to make things worse rather than better. Then on the other hand, you have poorer countries, the less developed countries, in which actually environmental damage and social problems are linked more to poverty. And so for those areas of the globe, what you actually do need is more economic growth. So Tim Jackson's view of the future for the world that could be sustainable is really a sort of two-speed solution, that in industrialized economies, we need to come up with degrowth strategies where we become less dependent on continuing economic growth for our future well-being, whereas in poorer countries, they need economic growth to solve problems linked to poverty and to unsustainable exploitation of the environment in those countries. The problem is that's a relatively hard sell, particularly in developed countries, to say, well, economic growth, the thing we've been pursuing all these years, is no longer what we want. It's no longer the solution. We need to pursue something else. The notion that Tim Jackson puts forward is prosperity, which, unlike GDP, is not a quantitative measure. It's a qualitative measure. So it's saying we pursue quality of life. And within the report, it looks at prosperity really as a notion of maximizing our opportunities for development and really focusing on notions of well-being so that we may consume less, we may earn less, we may have a less conventionally wealthy lifestyle. And yet maybe we could have a lifestyle that is more enjoyable, which makes us feel more prosperous, makes us feel better, because we focus very much on developing and promoting that which is good in society and that which generates a sense of well-being for us, rather than worrying about the endless pursuit of economic growth. The nice thing about Tim Jackson's report is it's very comprehensive and it's very holistic. It does paint a picture of an economic and social system that I think would work if we had the bravery to move towards it as a society. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult for politicians to stand up and say, actually, no, economic growth is no longer the solution. And if you look recently at the American presidential debates that have been ongoing, that both candidates have been very much leading on the issue of how to get America working again, how to re-stimulate economic growth within the country. Unfortunately, what we know is of some of the economic growth of recent years was fundamentally unsustainable. When we had the credit crunch in 2008 and the financial crisis that arose from that, it was because the nature of the economic growth that we had maintained over the decades before was unsustainable. It was supported by unsustainable levels of debt amongst governments, amongst companies, amongst consumers. We had the credit crunch in 2008 because of a financially unsustainable approach to business and to running the economy. I think the danger is if we just return to the pursuit of economic growth as the overriding objective once again, we'll just hit a series of other crunches. We'll hit the energy crunch, we'll hit the climate change crunch, we'll hit the ecosystem services crunch in due course. And really, perhaps it's time to start thinking about managing our economy so we don't keep crashing against its limits, whether those limits are financial, environmental, or social, but we start to manage the economy so it doesn't hit those limits, it doesn't crash against them. Because otherwise, the alternative is that we'll have to move towards a more sustainable way of living, really because we hit some form of crisis point, environmentally, socially, or financially, and that we'll have some sort of crash course route into a sustainable society, rather than trying to manage it by managing society and economic development in a way that takes us in a more gradual path towards a lower growth economy within our developed economies. There are various visions that people have tried to work through of what might a sustainable economy and society look like. WWF, working with academics from the University of Manchester, tried to develop a fairly comprehensive model of what a more sustainable economy might look like. They framed it in terms of the notion of a one planet economy. We know that in the majority of European countries, for example, the resource use on average that consumers are using up in terms of their lifestyles would actually require about 3 planets worth of resources if we extended that lifestyle to the whole planet. So what we really need to do is to move towards a situation where the Earth share of each consumer across the globe is one Earth share, so that when you add it all together, it makes the resources that one planet can supply. At the moment, for example, China, the average wealth and lifestyle of a Chinese consumer is about one Earth share. If all of us lived at exactly the same level across the planet, it would be sustainable. Having said that, the ecological footprint of Chinese consumers is rising rapidly as the average wealth within the country rises too. But the one planet economy is the idea of, well, can we create an economy in which we all live in relative prosperity in a way that doesn't require more resources than one single planet can provide? And the one planet economy model really paints a picture of a way of living. There's a whole range of different dimensions to it, about perhaps moving towards more localized business and production and consumption systems, away from a very globalized way of meeting our needs, that is environmentally orientated in terms of the management practices and waste practices of businesses, so that our production and distribution systems are lower impact, and also maybe getting our businesses to work together more in a smarter way, using industrial ecology principles, so that the waste products produced by one type of business become the raw materials going into another type of business. And we're seeing examples like eco-industrial parks that are starting to pull businesses together to become more ecologically efficient in the way they produce, and really also trying to make the economy less dependent on fossil fuels, using more renewable energy to reduce our CO2 emissions. But it's not just about the hardware of the economy, it's also about the software. It's about financial and business services that support companies in making the transition towards more sustainable solutions, so that they have the support and the management tools to develop more sustainable businesses. About developing sustainable markets through things like ethical trading, so that not just consumers but companies and other organizations use their purchasing power to move us towards more sustainable solutions. The One Planet economy model does also highlight social marketing, which we talked about in the previous episode, as a way to promote those sustainable behaviors amongst citizens and consumers, and also using IT to make it a smart economy that helps us to find information-driven ways to consume and produce and use resources more efficiently. And then also using this notion of social enterprise as a different type of business, a less profit-oriented type of business, more community-focused types of businesses that maybe can work together with other types of companies, with governments, for example, and other types of organizations to come up with more collaborative ways of living, producing and consuming that don't overshoot the limits of the planet. And that really takes us away from notions of conventional business and marketing, really into ideas of public policy, of things like planning, for example, of creating not just markets within which people can consume more in a more ecologically sustainable way, or homes in which it's easier to lead a more sustainable life, but really creating communities, creating places where people can live that have a whole range of dimensions to do with the transport infrastructure, to do with the local economy, to do with the types of housing that are available, to do with the way that communities are governed and services are provided to them, all of which contribute to and drive us towards a more sustainable solution, a more sustainable way of living. And this particular model that you see on the slide comes from the UK government and its agenda for sustainable placemaking, about trying to create towns, cities, communities within which it's much easier for people to lead more sustainable lives. So ultimately, that's the social and the economic transformation that confronts us if we are to actually fulfill the promises of the Brundtland Report and find a way of living that doesn't impoverish future generations, to find a way of living, of consuming, of producing, of managing our companies, for example, that is in tune with notions of sustainability and sustainable development. In terms of marketers, it really does mean a change to more than just the products and services that you provide to consumers and the way you run your business and its production system and supply chain. It's actually about thinking differently about marketing. And sustainability marketing, in terms of its time frame, is about thinking about the future in terms of multi-generational futurity. It's thinking about beyond the current generation of consumers, investors, workers, and so on, which is very different to existing marketing thinking, which does tend to think about here and now and the short term. In terms of the objectives, sustainability marketing is much more about promoting and delivering welfare to consumers rather than just a more shallow concept of gratification, which tends to dominate the current marketing agenda. The guiding principle is one of equity, that we need to move towards greater social equity between countries, between generations, between sexes, rather than purely being driven by consumer sovereignty and the notion of whatever the current generation of consumers can afford to buy, it is right to supply to them. In terms of the focus for marketing, currently the focus is very much on the wants, particularly of the rich, and I think we need in the future increasingly to balance that with meeting the needs of the global poor and to find new types of business solutions to help meet their need and spread the wealth to them. Our view of the world as marketers needs to go away from a relatively economic textbook view of economic geography and thinking about the world as a global consumption and production system, to think of it as a global environment, a living, breathing planet, a planet that is fragile in the sense that we can impair the environmental systems within it that we all depend upon, and it needs to be thought about and understood as a global environmental system. And then finally, really thinking about the setting for marketing, that it doesn't just exist within some form of economic hyperspace where there is infinite resources available and infinite capacity to deal with the waste or other consequences of our production and consumption, that the whole system exists within environmental limits that ultimately must be respected, and that we need to really find ways of living, working, managing, producing and consuming within environmental limits sooner rather than later, before those limits become very urgent and some form of environmental crunch confronts society and the global economy. So it is a considerable agenda of change and challenge for the marketing profession, both in terms of marketing practitioners and those who are learning about marketing. Our book, Sustainability Marketing, is very much written to try and help people to make that transition in the way they think about marketing, the way they practice marketing, the way they understand marketing, to create a type of marketing for the 21st century that is sustainable, is more equitable, and really is fit for a future in which we will face many social and environmental challenges of sustainability. So we very much hope the book does change your thinking, challenge your thinking, and that you've enjoyed the journey we've taken so far to reach this point. In terms of the final discussion and review questions you might like to think about is whether improved prosperity without increasing economic growth is a realistic ambition for society. Can we really adopt it? Second, reviewing what would the characteristics of a one-planet society and economy be. And finally, just review those ways in which marketing thinking will need to change if we're going to make greater and more substantive progress towards sustainability. The references are, for this particular episode, is the final chapter, chapter 12 in our book, Sustainability Marketing, which covers a wide range of the points that I've covered in this episode. I would also recommend to you Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth report, available both as a report and as a book, The Economics for a Finite Planet, which really does produce and present a very comprehensive and holistic view of how we might make that journey towards a different type of economy and society. And finally, Richard Verey's produced a very interesting paper in the Journal of Macro Marketing, really about how we change marketing towards a focus on welfare rather than on consumption, and how we might help marketing to play a part in genuinely transforming society to become more sustainable. So thank you very much for listening to this lectures and all the others, and bye for now.